Good evening. You're very welcome to this edition of Ireland's Generation X, a series that focuses on the group of people born between 1965 and 1985, an artistic generation caught between baby boomers and millennials. We're delighted to present Ireland's Generation X in partnership with the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Simon O'Connor. I'm the director here at MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, located on Dublin's St Stephen's Green. And though the museum's doors may be closed at the moment, we've been very busy working behind the scenes on new exhibitions as well as our digital and learning programs. And you can check out all of our latest work at MoLI.ie. This evening, we're joined once again by Professor Barry McCrea, himself a novelist and a scholar of comparative literature, who will be in conversation with Paul Murray, author of the novels An Evening of Long Goodbyes, Skippy Dies, and The Mark and the Void. Before I go, I'd like to tell you a little about the Edna O'Brien Young Writers Bursary, which is a week-long immersive programme taking place this summer. It's an amazing opportunity for anyone aged 15 to 17 with an interest in writing. It's easy to apply and applications are due by the 29th of March, not too far away now. So please help us to spread the word. Visit MoLI.ie/bursary for some more information on that. Finally, if you enjoy tonight's programme, I'd encourage you to buy MoLI membership for yourself or for a friend. It's really the best way to support the museum and our programming. And with that, I will hand you over to Professor Barry McCrea and Paul Murray. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'd also like to thank, before we start, two other people who don't appear on the screen. One is Benedict Schlepper-Connolly, and the other is my colleague Catherine Wilsden, who conceived this series with me. And even though you don't see Catherine, she was a big part of the intellectual impulse behind it. So as Simon said, our guest this evening is Paul Murray. He is the author of these three books, all of them very successful, all of them very different, and all of them very successful. So you're very welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Barry.
I thought we might start off with some biographical stuff. So the idea of this series is to talk to writers of this generation and find out a bit about what in their generation made them the writers they are. So maybe just tell us a bit about your background. So you're not from the John McGahern school or background, but you're from, I suppose, suburban. Is that the...
Yeah. I grew up in Killiney, not the part of Killiney that Bono lives in, Christaberg, just the kind of the pretty straight up suburbs of Killiney. My dad was a professor of drama in UCD, and which meant that the house was always full of books. And I guess that's how I sort of remember my growing up, was like the library was a big part of my childhood. We go to the kind of slightly grim library in Dunleary every week. It's now been replaced by the ultra modern Lexicon library, where I'd quite happily live. That was the childhood. Yeah.
And apart from all the books at home and the literary culture at home, how would you describe the cultural landscape of suburban South Dublin? It's not where people think of first when they think of Irish literature.
Yeah, I would say blasted would be a good word to describe it, perhaps. Beckettian. There wasn't much going on, really. And I felt like, I was probably predisposed to not finding a lot going on. I was kind of quite, the teachers would have said that I had a negative attitude and I was sort of cynical and so forth. I think I was more just sort of disappointed. But it seemed to me that the suburbs were a very I'm a parent now, so I love the suburbs because they're a safe place to raise your children, and there's lots of leafy streets and so on, and tennis courts nearby if you want them. But at the time, it felt like a real wasteland. Very, very a place where nothing was really happening in terms of thought. Nothing. Life always felt like it was happening somewhere else. That's the feeling I had. in my teens and until I left home. And I think that's it's probably, like, negative attitude notwithstanding, I feel that was kind of fair enough summation of it, because I've got friends who live in the same part of the world now, and it does seem, no offense to anybody who lives in that neck of the woods, but if you're into washing your car, then that's there's a lot there for you. But if you're into like furious political thought, or like deep ontology, or whatever kind of crazy stuff that I wanted to be into at the time, like, you need to look elsewhere.
I mean, you could say part of the job of the Irish writer is usually to talk about the endless complexity and depth of the place they come from. So you're coming from a different, at least attitudinal standpoint. So maybe we can talk about your attitude for a minute, if you don't mind, because you used the words, you said the teacher said you were cynical. This is something that has come up a couple of times in these conversations. Do you think irony or cynicism is, in Ireland as well as in other countries, a particularly Gen X standpoint? Like, do you think it was something that kind of osmosed into you?
There's a line from a song by a band called American Music Club, which were very much a Generation X band. And there's a line about the rat who got tired running the maze, and the scientist thought he was dumb, but he was just disappointed. And I feel like that's certainly for me, and probably for like a lot of the people I knew then, the cynicism was more sort of just frustration at the kind of monolithic nature of the culture of the time. Like, I think today, because as in our modern world, you're connected to everything, everywhere, all the time. It's almost impossible to remember how just one-dimensional Ireland was at the time, and like, Dublin is a capital city, and but the suburb felt like a suburb anywhere, which is to say, it was a place where it's kind of deliberately made to be sort of ahistorical. It's deliberately made to be somewhere where things don't happen. And Ireland itself was a place where things weren't really supposed to happen. If you had notions, if you had attitudes, if you wanted to create something different, you were kind of invited to go elsewhere. Like, right up until I left college, which is like 1997, that's what people did. If you wanted to be an artist of any stripe, you pushed off to London or New York or to Europe, because there just wasn't really the infrastructure in Ireland to support anything other than the most mainstream kinds of culture, or at least that's what it felt like to me at the time. Like, I think there was like I know there's some interesting theater things happening, and the film industry was just starting to emerge, and there's some really interesting writers just starting to appear then. But I mean, in the world I was in, going to the school I went to, and then going on to college, it really felt like that the thrust of the mood of the nation and the thrust of the nation was to was very homogenous. It was still very much like dominated by the church. There was still an air of like the Troubles were still overhanging everything, which really cast awful, again, something we kind of don't really remember, just the shadow that cast on everyday life. Every day you'd start your morning listening to the news about someone being killed. This endless chipping away at your soul. So, like, I think Generation X across the board, like in the United States, as well as in Ireland, felt like it was trapped beneath a monolithic culture. And in Ireland, maybe it took a different shape than it did to the United States. But I don't think cynicism is actually sort of a fair accusation. I think irony became a very important way of dealing with the frustrations and powerlessness that people felt. But that's not the same as cynicism. But I think maybe the lessons, well, this is something we can come to later on, but like, now one wonders how effective a tool irony really was, and Did it actually help at all, or did it just sort of, perpetuate the same, keep things the same instead of changing things?
Did people hide behind it? Yeah. I mean, I'm curious to know what about that predicament made you into the writer you became. So you had the impulse, obviously, the literary home, but in terms of how you came into consciousness of yourself as a writer, how would you say the background you came from, not the family, I mean, but the social background you're describing there, how that was part of that makeup?
Well, I like when I started writing, I just did it as a continuation of reading when I was a little kid. It just seemed like a natural thing to do. And when I got into school, I was quite good at art. I wasn't brilliant, but I was quite good. So I used to do a lot of comics, and then I used to watch. Me and my friends used to be really, we were like just nerds, just like classic nerds. We were really into comics, and we were really into like Monty Python, and kind of sketch shows, like UK sketch shows like that. And we kind of mimic those. So we do kind of comics that are a bit like 2000 AD, and we'd write these scripts that were a bit like Monty Python and the Holy Grail or whatever it might be. I got really into like Twin Peaks, started running when I was in school. And that was really exciting for me because it's sort of about the suburbs, and it's like terrible, like darkness underlying the suburbs. So I was really inspired by that, and nothing really good came of it. Like I started writing very derivative kind of Twin Peaks type scripts about little people and horses appearing in living rooms and so on. Yeah, I mean, I guess like at that stage, that kind of embryonic stage, what you're doing is just kind of mimicking, really, mimicking and trying to find, your own voice kind of gradually emerges out of that kind of accretion of different influences. But in terms of writing, writings was just one of the things I wanted to do. Like I wanted to write, but I also wanted to make films. I was pretty good at guitar, so I wanted to be in a band. I took art pretty seriously. And writing ended up being sort of a process of elimination. Writing was the thing I was probably best at or least worst at. And it was the easiest to do in terms of expense. If you wanted to be in a band, you needed, a drummer, and you needed, a space to rehearse in. If you wanted to make a film, I had no idea how you'd go about making a film. But writing, like the overheads are minimal, and eventually, like I thought, like in Ireland where so many doors felt closed, this was like the one door that felt like you didn't need a special pass to get through it. You didn't need to know anybody. You didn't need to find a way to play a gig in the Bag It In or whatever. You could just do it on your own and see where it led you.
So, and we'll talk about the individual books in a minute, but since you brought up reading, one of the things I've always felt about your writing is that you're an Irish writer who writes in some ways in the American literary tradition, or at least that the originality of your work is partly because it's a meeting, a confluence of Irishness, they're all set in Ireland, and an American literary tradition. Is that what you were reading? Because we've had I've talked to other writers who really have a very keen awareness of themselves writing in an Irish literary tradition, or maybe an Irish and UK one. But in your case, I feel there's a fairly American reading diet behind it. Was that true always, or is it true at all?
I kind of dispute the idea that one is part of a kind of a national tradition. Like I know it's like something that in terms of studying the literature is very important, but I don't know how much. Like Milan Kundera has an essay about the kind of the continuum, as he calls it, and how he wouldn't see himself as being part of a Czech continuum. Like Kafka's important to him, but like so would many other writers from many other countries. It's really more whose voice speaks to you personally, and whose voice you feel like you can draw something from that you're able to use to describe your own experience. Like so in some ways, like Irish writers, I'm going to say two contradictory things, which is that on the one hand, like Irish writers seemed too close for me to draw something useful from to describe my own experience, and at the same time, contradictorily, that Irish writers didn't seem to be describing the world that I lived in, so weren't introduced to me that way either. So I don't know if that makes any sense. But when I was growing up, Irish writing, as I perceived it, maybe wrongly, felt very much. There's this kind of very poisonous notion of authenticity, which I feel kind of hovers over literatures, national literatures, that whole world sometimes. And who's the Irishist, and what stuff is the true purview of a national literature. So the country, writing about the country, that's the Irish tradition. And part of the reason Joyce had such a hard time is because he was writing about a city, a modern city. I felt like I certainly wasn't coming from the country. So I wasn't authentic in that world, but I also wasn't really coming from the city. I was coming from the suburbs, and the suburbs, like I was trying to say, felt like this kind of deliberately kind of like anonymous kind of utopian in the bad way kind of a world, like the nowhere place, where it's not supposed to have like characteristics or identity other than safety and basic notions of kind of consumer satisfaction. So I felt like the American literature that came out of like the 50s and 60s, if you look at someone like Richard Yates in a book like Revolutionary Road, he's writing about that world in a very powerful way. He's looking at this kind of like marriage, which from the outside looks perfect, and the house looks perfect, and the street looks perfect, and you lift the lid on it, and it's just this inferno of rage and torture and violence, and it's an incredibly powerful book. And he uses the mundanity of that world to generate the inferno, which is really exciting to read. For me, it felt like the American writers, again, tradition is not a word I love, but like I lived in like a world of like a pop culture. I watched so much TV, terrible TV, American TV, British TV as well, but like and Glenroe obviously as well. But that world of pop culture seemed to me to be alive in American books that I wasn't finding it in the Irish novels that I read. Like I didn't extensively pursue Irish novels, frankly. And I know like that the writers that were coming up then, like, or maybe a little bit later, like Pat McCabe and Riley Doyle and writers like that, did draw on pop culture. But when I was in school and starting college, it felt like if you're reading someone like Pynchon was like obviously the big one for me. But like Jane McInerney or like Donna Tartt, like these young writers, it felt alive, and it felt a world that I was connected to in a way that I didn't feel I was getting from Irish books. But also, I was like, I wanted it to be an escapist. I was reading for it to escape. Like I'd like open my eyes, and I was in Ireland. I like Ireland 24/7. So I kind of had enough Ireland going on without seeking out more representations of Ireland. So the American world, because I'd never been to America, and that was a big part of it. Like the American world that appeared to me in books and appeared to me on TV felt like this higher realm, because it was unreal. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so the encounter with these American writers obviously was fundamental to you in your sense of what you could do as a writer. So maybe we'll go through the rest of your intellectual biography. So we have three institutions: Blackrock, infamous factory for the Irish ruling class in a way; Trinity, more complicatedly so; and then East Anglia. Do you want to just run us through your intellectual trajectory?
Well, Blackrock, I wrote about Blackrock in my second book, Skippy Dies, which is sort of like the school was kind of based on Blackrock. It's not exactly the same. I'm at pains to say that the teachers in the book aren't the teachers that I had in school. I had some really nice teachers who helped me. But Blackrock was a difficult place for me to be. My parents were very kind, loving, supportive people. I don't know why they sent me to that school, because they were they'd been, my dad taught in UCD, and they'd been over in they spent like the 60s in the US, like in Yale, where they go on marches with the Black Panthers and stuff, and like they're quite kind of cool and lefty. And I don't know why they sent me to Blackrock. Maybe they didn't know quite what it was, but it's very, very, again, like monolithic. It's the most institutional of institutions. It was a place that's like more so than almost anything I can think of in Ireland beyond the church itself, was an institution that had lasted at that point for, I think it was about 120 years old maybe, but just stood for like just solid Catholic bourgeois values, and like I don't know how much it's changed now. I get sort of things on my WhatsApp about the school now, where you get sort of trailers for like for the school, for like ads for the school, and there's kind of nods towards diversity and nods towards different ways of doing things. And maybe that's the case now. At the time, it was all about rugby, and if you didn't play rugby, I mean, that sounds like such a sort of a kind of a cartoonish way of presenting it, but it really was super into rugby. And it was very hierarchical. And if you're like good at rugby, you were sort of top of the tree. And if you weren't into rugby, so you could, if you weren't, I couldn't play. Obviously, I was no good. I was really very bad at rugby, but I also didn't really like watching rugby. It's quite a boring sport to watch. I like watching soccer, and I was good at playing soccer, but soccer wasn't played in Blackrock, because it was the working class sport. Blackrock imported rugby. They just took on rugby because that's what they played in the public schools in the UK, and they wanted to look like a Catholic public school. So it was very hierarchical. It wasn't really like, it was very academic in terms of it was very invested in getting lots of maximum points, in getting high points. They wanted the kids to get high points. But in terms of anything else, like it was really kind of pretty conservative. Like one the key moment for me with regard to that was like my friends and I tried to make a short film, and on the premises of the school, and it was a film. It's kind of like a short about a murder within the debating society. Debating was quite big, and it was called Motion for Murder. And like I don't know why I did this, but I took it to the principal just to get clearance to film within the school. And the principal was this quite sort of cerebral priest, and he kind of refused to allow us to film this little short, this kind of idiotic short called Motion for Murder, because it had a murder in it. It was just this kind of comedy thing, but he wouldn't let us do it. And I was kind of astonished by that. We'd had lots of pushback in terms of like, anything you tried to do there, like in art class, if you did like a picture thing, like you might have problems from the teacher with that, but it really was very conservative, and I really didn't belong there, and I wasn't a useful student for them to have there. And everyone would have been happy. I would have been happy if I wasn't there. The school would have been happier if I wasn't there. It was just a bad mix. It was just a bad relationship.
Sorry to interrupt you, but then you put it on the literary map. I mean, then the result of this was eventually Skippy Dies, which is this vast, very colourful world, which obviously springs out of that. Maybe we talk a bit about Skippy. I know we're going out of order a bit, but
yeah.
But do you want to tell us something about Skippy and how you arrived at it?
Well, like I left Blackrock when I was 18, and I never thought about it again. I was so happy to be gone, and I just didn't think about it even in terms of happiness. I was just happy. I just had a new life, and that little sort of that time had no relevance to me. And then I started writing this short story, which was going to be like a two-hander about a teacher and a kid in his class. And the kid has a problem, and the teacher wants to know what the problem is. He's a biology teacher, and the kid's written this essay about sea anemones, except he writes it sea enemy. And the teacher's going like, why is he written sea enemy? So like this like little pun, this was the seed of the whole thing. So I started writing this story about the teacher and the kid. And I got to a point in the story where the bell rings and the kids all leave the class, and the teacher gathers up his things and he walks out the door into the corridor. And he's sort of surrounded. He's in a sea of this kind of ferment of kind of 14 and 15-year-old boys on their way to the next class. And it was like the Wizard of Oz. It was like I could just see that world so vividly, and I could see all of the characters, and I could see all these different I could see all these different kids that I'd been in school with. We'd all been penned in together for so long, and the whole world came back to me so strongly. And for a while, I sort of resisted it. I didn't even resist it. I was writing this short story and describing all of these things that I could see, and it was just getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And I was going, oh my God, how am I going to cut back my short story, which is now like 85 pages long, and make it to 15 pages long? And I remember talking to my brother, and my brother saying, well, it sounds more like a novel. And I was like, oh yeah, of course it's a novel, you know? It hadn't sort of struck me. But as you can gather, like, I mean, I had a lot to say about it, and I had a lot to, those experiences that you have at that time in your life are so, you feel things so vividly and so strongly at that point in your life, even if your world at that time feels so monotonous and so boring and so empty, and everyone around you seems like such a dick, and like everything they say is so idiotic. But nevertheless, like that monotony has this kind of richness to it, you know. And when you revisit those people and that time, like from like when I started writing the book, it was like it was maybe how long was it? Like maybe 10 years since I'd left, and suddenly the kind of the grotesquerie isn't quite the word I want, but just the color of the time, just like the fact that you're penned in with all these people who are so different to you. Like at no other time in your life will you be surrounded by people who are like, there was 200 people in my year in Blackrock, 220 people, and you know they were as varied as 220 people can be, you know, and there I was amid them, you know, and I think that we were in this very, very conservative institution, which was like very, very intent on producing, as you said, like sort of the factory for producing, basically people who work in finance. The guys who passed me on my bike in their Audis every day, you know, those were the people that Blackrock wanted to produce. But at the time, they were all like me, like these powerless adolescents, and everybody was just freaking out. So you had this very, very conservative institution, and then like 220 kids in a single sex school just going crazy. So like there was a really, you know, there was a lot to write about. Put it that way.
So your first novel, An Evening of Long Goodbyes, is set out in the southern suburbs where you grew up. The next one, Skippy Dies, set in Blackrock College. We've moved up the coast and moved up ahead in your life to secondary school. But then we don't have a Trinity novel, which is where you went next. So you're, in some ways, you're almost exceptional in your generation of Dublin writers not to have produced a Trinity novel.
Yeah.
Why is that? Or are you going to
I'm sort of, I don't know if I should be ashamed or chastened to admit that I'm currently working on my Trinity novel. It's mostly set in the Midlands, but it's got a couple of sections which are set in Trinity. And Trinity was, I mean, Blackrock was something. It was easy in retrospect to get a read on, and it was easy to say something about Ireland through the lens of Blackrock, because if I was writing that book during the Celtic Tiger, and the Celtic Tiger was basically, conducted by people who'd been to Blackrock, and the ethics of the Ireland of that time were the ethics of the church that, it was a Catholic school run by an order of priests. So the orders like that order had sort of endorsed the kind of the economy that we had and the culture that we had at the time. Trinity was like a much harder place to get a read on. I mean, I really admired your book set in Trinity. I thought that was very, you investigated there's different worlds within Trinity, but it took me a while to figure out what angle I wanted to take about Trinity and how I even felt about Trinity, because I was like, it was difficult in a different way to Blackrock, but the difficulty of Blackrock led on to the difficulty of Trinity, which is to say that Blackrock was this uber kind of like middle class suburban Catholic experience, single sex, when Trinity was obviously like the kind of the culture of Trinity is much different. My mother, when she was growing up, you couldn't, if you're a Catholic, you couldn't go to Trinity. Nobody went to Trinity, because it was, I don't know if it was technically a sin, but it was certainly very much looked down on or frowned upon to go to Trinity if you weren't a Protestant. It was the Protestant college. So it had that kind of air of darkness about it. It was full of, it was co-ed. So I mean, that was like a major sort of shift in gear for me. That wasn't a bad thing. It was great to have conversations with girls, and that was great. But there was aristocrats there. There was an aristocrat in my philosophy class who won't name, but he and his friends like inhabited this kind of this. So there was Trinity. There was the Trinity that we were in. Then there was this kind of this other Trinity where it was the people who didn't get into Oxbridge or Durham. I think Trinity was next on the list. So they were like this fantastic. Everyone was like sort of like 6.5 foot tall, and like cheekbones and very un-Irish things like that. And we're living this kind of like Brideshead Revisited type life, which is just like, we all felt like sort of like leprechauns, kind of hopping around among these people. There was a lot of, I mean, that wasn't sort of the issue for me either. I think it was just such a shift in gear. Like, you had a lot of, everyone who went to Trinity was quite clever. You had to get quite high points to get to Trinity. So everyone had been kind of quite good in their school lives. Everyone had worked hard to get the points to go to Trinity. And now everybody, so you had a college full of nerds, broadly speaking, or a college full of very diligent, quite obedient people. And they'd come to college, and now they were furiously trying to reinvent themselves as kind of, people with something of interest to say. And there was quite a lot of, I didn't see it that way at the time, but I found people quite intimidating. I wasn't really good at pretending. And I didn't get that other people were that there might be something behind people's facade. People were kind of felt insecure, and this is why they're behaving that way. But people felt quite scary, and people were kind of not all super well behaved. There's a lot of I did a 2-subject moderatorship of English and philosophy, and within our little sort of Venn diagram of people who did both those subjects, there's a lot of mental illness. People had, in second year in particular, there was a lot of the people I knew was friends with had run into very, very serious issues, which ended. Well, I had a very close friend who committed suicide in my 4th year, and that was the definitive experience for me of Trinity ultimately. It was such a heartbreak for me and for all my friends at the time. And I felt like it was the culmination of Whereas in Blackrock, we were sort of sat on and we were sort of controlled or molded in a very sort of clumsy but harsh way. In Trinity, you were just at sea. You know, you're sort of left to your own devices. The faculty kind of did their 8 hours a week or whatever, and that was kind of largely it. You know, so for a bunch of very wet behind the ear kids, you know, you could go massively astray in that environment, and people did. And I was living with my parents, you know, so I didn't have the scope to kind of really go off the rails. Maybe that was a good thing in retrospect, but it was like a weird time. People were finding themselves, and that was in books that's often a joyous experience, but I think in reality, or certainly in that reality, it was a difficult experience. People had a hard time, and there were casualties. And yeah, that was my Trinity experience. So as I write about it now, it's still something that's very, very complex, and that I feel yeah, it was just being thrown into the, I don't know even know if we were thrown into the adult world. We were thrown into some kind of world of that we weren't equipped to deal with, and people got hurt.
So in some ways there's an open wound there, whereas I suppose Blackrock was this closed experience that you were then able to use as a window on the world with all these digressions. And that Trinity seems like, because then you went, obviously by the end of Trinity you were a writer already, because you went to the famous program in East Anglia. Right.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Trinity was like, again, I had some great, I don't want to run down Trinity. I had some great friends in Trinity, and there was some I think I went about it wrong.
I don't feel you're running it down, Paul. You're more bringing out an emotional complexity that, you know, the university, especially in novels, often is just this shining paradise on a hill where you finally go to become your true self. And in fact,
well, I mean, I guess that's the thing, you know. You I mean, that's what people expect, and your true self is kind of an elusive commodity. So, and writing for me in Trinity was a bit I wrote a lot, but I didn't get any returns from it. So it was a bit demoralizing. There was like a writer's workshop every year, and every year I'd sort of apply, and every year I wouldn't get in. And then finally, in my last year, I was accepted. Deirdre Madden was giving this workshop, which I remember you took part in too. And for me, that was really important to be validated in that way, and to have people reading my work, because I never shared it with my friends. So that was a huge thing for me. Which I then, I don't know if it, yeah, anyway, I went to UEA about 4 years after I finished college, and in the meantime, I'd written this kind of very derivative kind of postmodern, like American type novel, which I needed to get out of my system. It probably wasn't very good. And then I'd started another novel and stalled with that. I started working in Waterstone's bookshop, and I spent a year of Waterstone's is gone now. It used to be on Dawson Street, opposite Hodges Figgis, and it was just a wonderful year of my life, surrounded by very booky people, just having great conversations and reading books I would never have read otherwise, and doing a lot of drinking in the Duke pub. And by the time I finished up to go to UA, it was probably the time for me to go. It's quite a seductive world. And then UEA was like, I mean, I'm going to sound like I just have this series of nothing satisfies me, or UEA was a postgraduate world. So I hadn't obviously been a postgrad before, but you're kind of on your own. Like you're like the population of the university is an undergraduate population, and doing a master's, you're sort of on your tag. And the university itself is like, it's outside Norwich, which is a weird town in its own right. We can come back to that if you want. The university's outside, and it's this famous campus. It's this kind of brutalist architecture. I think it was designed in the 60s. it's a really strange looking place, and it's quite desolate. And there's a lake outside us. There's a lake on the campus with swans. And every day I'd go for, I was sort of stuck there, didn't do it right. And every day I'd go and walk around the lake and, be assailed by these kind of quite vicious swans that live there. It was great in terms of, I got a lot of writing done. I had a wonderful tutor called Ali Smith, the writer Ali Smith, and she recommended my book to her editor. And when I finished my course and came home and was broke and was back with my parents, this beautiful moment arrived when the editor at Hamish Hamilton, Simon, wrote me an email saying, Ali's told me about your book and we'd like to see it and send it to us. So I did. So it was great. Like UEA was wonderful for me in that way. And it was wonderful to me in terms of giving me time to work on my book, which I don't know if I would have done otherwise, because I was enjoying Dublin at that point so much. I was more confident. I had lots of friends, and those things aren't necessarily conducive to writing. Whereas in UEA, you're as I say, you're kind of stuck in this campus, and I was like an Irishman in England, which was quite a strange experience too. I got quite patriotic. I started reading like Yeats's letters and Joyce's letters, and I bought Finnegan's Wake, though I didn't make much headway with that. But the book that came out of that eventually, An Evening of Long Goodbyes, was written, I think, out of that sense of, I'd always had problems kind of writing about my own world that I lived in. I was always like trying to kind of like write about this imaginary world that I thought was real. And being abroad, being in UEA, helped me to just get a bit of perspective on Dublin and the things that I loved about Dublin, and to start to kind of see value in that world that I hadn't seen before.
I want to ask, we're going to open for questions in a minute, but I want to ask you about these imaginary worlds, because your most recent novel, The Mark and the Void, is a very different world. So you keep moving up the Dublin coast all the way, this time to the Financial Services Centre. And Skippy Dies caught the imagination of all sorts of people, including David Cameron, as I recall. But The Mark and the Void is not a very, I suppose, Tory-friendly book. But especially more seriously, it's very connected to contemporary events, to current affairs, to the banking crisis. Once you said to me that Skippy Dies has a spoiler in the title, and that book too begins with a preface that tells you a lot about what the book is going to be about. I can see there are structural similarities between them, but it's also a very different departure. Maybe just because it's a controversial question, that maybe say something about your decision to write something that was so connected to things that were going on in the real world, in the political and financial world.
Yeah, well, I mean, the genesis of that book was kind of complicated in that it was written in two stages. So before I wrote Skippy, I wrote a draft of Mark and the Void. It was called something different then, and it was just a funny book. It was just it was about like a Frenchman, this banker who's very ingenuous. He's very clever and he's very rich, but he's very ingenuous and very innocent, and he's kind of romantic and naive. And he meets this writer called Paul, who is very disingenuous and very sneaky and very untruthful. The reason I think I got that idea because I used to work in, not a bank, but the first job I had out of college was something called a bank operations center, which was literally an underground bunker in Cabinteely in the suburbs of Dublin, quite near where I lived. And it was an underground bunker where the bank sort of preserved all the records of its daily activities. And I was in charge of this check machine, which is huge machine, the length of a house. And it would sort of record, it would shoot all these checks through it. And record them and barcode them and do various things to them. And the physical checks had to physically pass through this machine, which is very, very delicate. My job was to physically put the checks in very delicately. And if you didn't do it right, the machine would sort of grind to a halt, and you'd have to call the engineers and they'd fix it. And it was very, very, it was mind numbing, and I was standing all day beside this machine, putting like millions of euros, millions of pounds, as it was, of checks through this machine every day. And you'd start at 2 p.m. and you'd leave when the checks were done. So like 10 p.m. and a good day, but in Christmas, like more like 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And I felt like there's a Bob Dylan line, you know, what is it, 20 years of school and they put you on the day shift. And I felt like it was very hard at that point to get a job in Ireland. Still, like 97, the boom hadn't quite hit. Finance was the only kind of game in town. And I felt like my education, doing that job, it felt like everything I learned was like utterly meaningless. It was such a waste of time. And I could feel my brain atrophying. So I started reading Roland Barthes. We had this Roland Barthes reader at home, and I'd never read him. I'd always sort of avoided those classes in college. But I really enjoyed Roland Barthes and that world of mythologies. So I had this. So for that reason, I had this connection in my head between French philosophy and banking, and the two having this opposition. So when I started writing this book a few years later, it seemed quite natural to have like a French banker who's basically kind of a philosopher, and this writer having this exchange. When I wrote the first draft, it was funny, but it wasn't anything else, and I felt like it didn't have enough. I felt like there needed to be something not funny to drive the humor. Otherwise, the humor just became kind of tiresome to me. I don't know, maybe not to other people, but to me, it felt like it just didn't work. So I put it to one side, and then the banking crash came along, and I realized that basically the guys from Skippy Dies had graduated and become extremely rich. In fact, I mean, I remember reading, I think in the Irish Times magazine, where a guy from my class, who was not one of the smart guys from my class, but now he was a hedge fund trader in New York City. And he had like a little thing in the Irish Times, you know, the magazine, Wicked magazine, describing his favorite cocktail that he used to get in this, like in some, you know, and I was like, Jesus Christ, like that guy, he was really not one of the bright guys, but he was trading in these like hundreds of millions of dollars. And the more I read, the more I learned about the banking crash, and what became almost took out the entire civilization. You know, I mean, we were like sort of like hours away from like the ATMs not giving you any money and the whole thing coming down. And that global meltdown that almost was, that was happening in Ireland, in Dublin, in South Dublin, with the kind of guys I went to school with. So there was plenty of anger there. There was plenty of darkness there. Once you started going into that world, and the idiocy of it, and the maleness of it, and the swagger and confidence of it.
Yeah.
You know, that became the engine for the kind of the comedy. Then, you know, the two things kind of fed off each other in a more satisfying way. Then.
No, and it's been praised as one of the only real literary treatments of that. So that's I have loads more questions about that, but I'm going to go to the questions in the chat. And just to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, just type it into the Zoom chat, and I'll ask it. So this question from Susan: as someone from Generation X, how do you feel different from the baby boomer generations in Ireland?
It's a good question. I mean, I feel a lot less rich, I guess, would be the simple answer to that. The baby boomers, like, God bless them, there was a massive transfer of wealth to the generation above us that came with the boom in the early 2000s. So anybody that owned property in the boom became many multiples wealthier, and all the mugs who came along in like 1999, 2000. You know, you spend the rest of your life trying to catch up with that. I think that it's a difficult question. I mean, Generation X, I feel like was very disaffected and really found it hard to find anything else to believe in. My sense is of the millennials, like I don't know how much faith one should put in these kind of very broad generalizations. But my sense is of millennials is that they're quite ideological and they believe strongly, in kind of various political statements. Whereas I think if you're Generation X, you've grown up railing against those kind of ideological certainties because they've all been shown to be predicated on lies. So you've got a real suspicion of anybody delivering any kind of ex cathedra judgments. Like, for instance, for me, like definitive things for me growing up were like the Iraq War, when you're just watching just lie after lie after lie after lie being told, and like various politicians falling in line with it. The Catholic Church's, endless lying about the abuse scandals. Then latterly you had the financial crisis, which was like the entire economic system of the entire world being based on more lying. So I think as a Generation Xer, you are predisposed to extreme skepticism, which I don't think. I was going to say I don't think that's an unhealthy way to live, but I think it takes its toll. You kind of you don't know. I envy the millennials with their belief that they can change things. I think that's like reading Naomi Klein, like that book No Logo was really important. When I was a kid, but in Ireland in particular, there was a sense of I don't know if it was just me, but I don't. Maybe you'd like to shed some light on this, Barry. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, like, did you feel like there's I don't know that I had a strong sense that anything could be put in the place of the world I wanted to tear down.
I mean, I think this is a good actually segue to another question from Catherine, which is, do you think the mix of comedy and tragedy in Skippy Dies speaks to a particular Gen X experience? I might just add a twist on that to go back to the earlier question you brought up about cynicism and irony and the use of them. Because you say, well, so it's the kind of non-ideological, non-Gen X humor and irony and all of that. On the other hand, as the Mark and the Void shows, in some ways your work is intensely ideological while being funny. So I suppose the question is, in what way is humor at odds with an ideological program or a desire for political change, and to what extent is it in service of it? And I think in that sense, to me anyway, Skippy Dies and The Mark and the Void are very Gen X novels. But do you have any thoughts on that, since you brought it up yourself earlier?
Yeah. Well,
sorry, just an example. So there's an example in Skippy Dies, and a few people quoted this in reviews, I think, where somebody lights a fart, puts a fart on fire, and there's this actually quite lyrical account of how the room is illuminated by it. And then in The Mark and the Void, we have this horrific landscape of greedy bankers and financial crash, and then these laugh out loud gags about so the writer Paul has written a book called For Love of a Clown, and I won't repeat your own jokes back to you, but there are some very funny gags about that running through it, but it's obviously very intensely ideological too. So you're working on two levels all the time, it seems to me. That also seems characteristic of the generation in a way.
Yeah, I think that well, like it was a very, like humor is like a classic, Irish trait, and it comes from being a country that's been like relentlessly invaded, and assailed by various much bigger entities, and in school, like that was happening to me kind of in microcosm pretty regularly. So you learn to defend yourself like by humor. It's a way to kind of get the bullies to stop punching you. It's also a way to kind of get a purchase on the world. Like here's a way that I can engage with the world with a world that seems kind of so different to me and so kind of opposed to me, here's a way that I can get a foothold on it, by making fun of it. And I can even get some sort of positive feedback from it. People will laugh at my jokes. With regard to the ideology, I don't know. I feel like there was like the classic Gen X line was, there's a filmmaker called Richard Linklater who made a film called Slacker, which is a fantastic film, really beautiful film. And there's a line in it like withdrawing in disgust is not the same as apathy. And that line spoke to me at the time and still does in a certain way. I feel like any time you sign yourself to an ideology of any kind, you're going to be drawn into some kind of reduction, or you're going to start that's a real Pynchon thing. Like Pynchon's sort of quite obsessed with this kind of German mode of thinking, whereby sort of you start fitting a mold onto reality to make things fit your to make the facts fit the viewpoint you want to sustain. And reality is very, very messy. So you end up becoming a fascist, and you can be a fascist even if you're on the left, you can be a fascist, I definitely didn't want to do that. And I felt like that humor was a safe way of putting my view across without assigning myself to any particular ideology.
Think maybe connected to that, because something I envy about the millennial writers is their confidence that they're going to be listened to. They feel sure that when they speak, people will hear them. And I wonder, for a Gen X writer, if comedy isn't a way to make sure you get the reader's attention and sympathy, because you're not sure of it at all. You're actually, and I suppose in Ireland, that maybe growing up in a world that was so full of children that you've never you couldn't be guaranteed an adult audience for anything you wanted to say, and that this particular brand of humor is a way to, what's what they call in Latin the captatio benevolentia, to capture the goodwill of the reader, so that once you have them, you can actually buttonhole them with what you want to say. And so we have, we're nearly done. We have time for one more question. This is Liam. As a suburban kid, but not solely a suburban focused writer, what would you say your relationship is with the center of the city? Did you feel culturally separated from it? Did it strike you as more of a place of cultural richness? Town, as we call it.
Yeah. Oh man, town is great. Town. I remember going into the Virgin Megastore and that was like, Dunkin' Donuts and the Coffee Inn. All those places were seemed kind of to vibrate with meaning and everything that I was looking for at the time. Maybe if I had just gone into town more, I would have been happier. Dublin had a lot going on at the time. But the suburban world of like Blackrock and its kind of orbit, it was its own thing. And so my friends didn't really go into town. Instead, you go to there was a little corner of hell called Hollywood Nights, and that was this kind of the nightclub that you'd go to, and there was a pub attached to it called the Bull and Bear, and it was really impossible. It was very hard to persuade people to kind of make the trip into town. In a way that's kind of difficult for me to understand. People didn't want to. They didn't want to experience a world beyond that little safe enclosed environment.
Well, that just brings us up to the hour. Thank you very much, Paul. There's loads more things I wanted to ask you, but maybe another time. And thank you everybody for coming, and see you next month. I think it's April 7th. I'm going to be talking to Nick Laird. But thanks again, Paul.
Thanks, Barry. Take care.